Picture the Roman Forum on a cold December morning in the year 43 before the Common Era. A crowd has gathered around the speaker's platform, the place where, for decades, a single voice had risen and shaken the foundations of the Republic. There is no voice this morning, only a head, nailed to the wooden beam, and beside it, 2 hands. In the account, the historian Cassius Dio would preserve 2 centuries later, Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony, approached the severed head that morning. She pulled a pin from her hair. She stabbed it into the tongue. Again and again. The tongue that had dared to say what no one else would say. His name was Marcus Tullius Cicero. He was born in a small town nobody important had ever heard of. His voice became one of the most powerful in the Roman world. And in the end, that voice is what killed him. This is the complete life of Cicero. Settle in. Let the world outside grow quiet. And let us begin. Chapter 1. The Boy from Arpinum. There is a question that runs underneath every part of the story we are about to tell. It is a question that thoughtful people have asked in every century since the Roman Republic fell, and it is still being asked today. Can words save a country? The man whose life we are about to follow believed, for most of his adult life, that they could. He staked everything on that belief, and what happened to him, and to the Republic he tried to defend, is one of the most carefully preserved records we have of what that belief costs the person who holds it. The town where Marcus Tullius Cicero was born in the year 106 before the Common Era does not appear on most maps of the Roman world. You have to look carefully to find it. Arpinum sat about 70 miles southeast of Rome, in the hill country of central Italy, a modest settlement of farmers and small landowners that had only received full Roman citizenship about 30 years before Cicero's birth. The town itself was quiet. Olive trees covered the slopes around it. A small river ran through the valley below. In the early morning, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, mist would rise from the water and settle in the low places. Men went out to their fields. Women worked at looms in small stone houses. Dogs barked in the distance. The rhythms of the day were the rhythms of agricultural Italy, little changed from the time of the earliest Roman settlements. This was the world Cicero was born into. It mattered more than it might seem. In Rome, where you came from determined almost everything about how far you could go. The great political families of the city had been at the centre of Roman power for centuries. They traced their ancestors back to the founding of the Republic, sometimes beyond it, to gods and heroes whose images filled their atriums in the form of wax death masks that descendants wore in funeral processions. These families did not simply participate in Roman politics. They were Roman politics. A boy born in Arpinum to a family no one in Rome had ever heard of was not, in the normal course of Roman life, going to become consul. He was not going to shape the destiny of the Republic. He was going to live a respectable provincial existence, marry a respectable provincial wife, and die in the same town where he was born. That Cicero did not have this life is the first and perhaps the most remarkable fact about him. His father was also named Marcus Tullius Cicero, as was the Roman custom. From the surviving evidence, he appears to have been a man of quiet disposition and persistent ill health. The family belonged to the equestrian class, which sat just below the senatorial aristocracy. They had property, they had standing in their own town, They did not have the thing that mattered most in Rome, which was a name that other Romans recognized when they heard it, but the father made a decision that would turn out to matter enormously. He decided that his two sons, Marcus and the younger Quintus, would receive the finest education available in the Roman world. This was not the usual choice for a family of their station. A boy of the equestrian class from a small town was expected to learn enough to manage the family estates and perhaps to argue a case in the local courts if the need arose. He was not expected to be trained as if he might one day stand in the Senate of Rome. The father made the decision anyway. He moved the family to Rome when Cicero was still young, taking a house in the district of Carinae, near the Forum. He spared no expense. He paid for his sons to learn Greek, which, in the Roman world of that era, was not merely a foreign language, but the gateway to the entire tradition of philosophy, rhetoric, and literature that educated Romans regarded as the foundation of civilized thought. Why did he do this? The historical record does not give us a clear answer. It is possible, as some later biographers speculated, that he saw something unusual in his elder son from an early age. It is also possible that he simply loved his children and wanted to give them every advantage he could afford. Whatever his reasons, the decision shaped everything that came afterward. The young Cicero took to the education with unusual intensity. He learned Greek thoroughly. He memorized vast quantities of poetry. He studied the speeches of the great Athenian orators, Demosthenes, above all, with a focus that suggested he was not merely absorbing them, but studying them for what they could teach him about something he already intended to do. In the stories that Plutarch would later preserve, parents of other boys would come to the school simply to watch young Cicero perform. Some reportedly went home worried that their own sons would be overshadowed. Plutarch was writing more than a century after these events, and his sources for such anecdotes are not always traceable. But the broader outline his sources preserved is consistent with what we see in Cicero's later writings. By the time he was a young man, he had established himself as one of the most promising students of his generation. The nickname that followed him throughout his life came from this period, though its exact origin is uncertain. Cicero, in Latin, means chickpea. It was either a family name inherited from an ancestor with a distinctive mark on his face, or it was a mocking nickname that Cicero himself deliberately kept rather than hide. When his friends suggested he change it before entering public life, he reportedly refused. He would make the name Cicero more honourable, he said, than the names of the great aristocratic families of Rome. It was the kind of thing a young man says before he has any real evidence that he can deliver on the promise. Cicero, as it turned out, was one of the few people in history who said such a thing and then did it. The Rome where he was doing this learning was not a stable city. It was a city that had, within living memory, begun to tear itself apart. The Republic had been in existence for more than 400 years by the time Cicero was born. It had expanded from a small city-state on the Tiber into the dominant power of the Mediterranean world, and somewhere in the process of becoming an empire, it had started to break. The institutions that had been designed to govern a small Italian republic were now being asked to govern territories and populations far beyond what they had been built for. The wealth flowing into Rome from its conquests had created inequalities that the old constitution had never contemplated. The armies that had once been raised for specific wars and then disbanded had begun to owe their loyalty to individual generals rather than to the state. The generation just before Cicero's had already seen the first signs of what was coming. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus had attempted reforms to redistribute public land to the poor and had both been killed by their political opponents. A general named Gaius Marius, a man also from Arpinum, had transformed the Roman army by recruiting from the landless poor, creating a force whose loyalty was to him personally rather than to the Senate. And during the years when Cicero was a student in Rome, Marius and his former lieutenant Sulla had begun the civil war that would see Roman armies march on the city of Rome itself. Cicero seems to have understood, very early, what this meant. His later writings return to the theme with a consistency that suggests he had been thinking about it since his youth. In a republic where the old certainties were breaking down, the power of words was becoming more important, not less. The man who could stand in the forum and move an audience could shape events in ways that mere wealth or birth could not. He also seems to have understood something that his later teachers would reinforce. Rhetoric, used well, required more than technique. It required knowledge that went beyond the tricks of persuasion to the actual substance of what was being persuaded about. A great orator, in the tradition he was absorbing from his Greek teachers, was not merely a clever speaker, he was a person of broad learning, sound judgment, and genuine commitment to the public good. This ideal was not a cynical pose. A provincial boy without family connections could not compete with the aristocracy on the grounds of birth. He could only compete on the grounds of merit. Character and learning were not optional extras for such a person. They were the only currency available. By his late teens, Cicero had absorbed everything his Roman teachers could give him. He had begun the daily discipline that would define his working life. He had started to appear in the lower levels of the Roman legal system as an advocate, and he was beginning to be noticed. The small boy from Arpinum had arrived, at least, at the threshold of the world he intended to enter. What he did not yet know, could not yet know, was what that world would cost the person who chose to take it seriously. The dictator Sulla was still alive. The bodies were still being counted in the streets. And somewhere in the crowded districts of Rome, a young advocate with an unusual name was preparing himself for a case that would make his reputation and nearly end his life at the same time. Chapter 2. Rome of the Swords. To understand what Cicero was walking into when he began his public career, you need to understand that the Rome of his youth was a city that had recently learned something terrible about itself. It had learned that nothing in its constitution, nothing in its traditions, nothing in the accumulated weight of 4 centuries of republican government could stop a Roman general from marching an army against Rome itself. This had happened for the first time in the year 88 before the Common Era. When Cicero was about 18 years old, the general was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. The dispute was over who would command the war against King Mithridates of Pontus. Sulla had been legally assigned the command. His rival Marius had the command transferred to himself through a vote of the popular assembly. By the logic of the old republic, Sulla should have accepted the decision and gone home. That was how the system was supposed to work. Disputes were to be resolved through institutional procedures, through votes and court cases and the slow accumulation of political alliances, not through violence. Sulla did not accept the decision. He went to his army, most of whom depended on him personally for their future rewards in land and money. Followed him. 6 legions marched south toward Rome. Most of the officers of these legions, who still had the old Roman sense of what was and was not permissible, refused to participate and left the army. The common soldiers marched anyway. They entered Rome. There was fighting in the streets. Marius fled. Sulla reorganized the political situation in his favor, then left for the Eastern War he had been trying to keep. What this event established, in the minds of everyone who was paying attention, was that the prohibition against bringing armies into the city of Rome, which had been one of the most fundamental assumptions of Roman political life for centuries, was no longer a prohibition. It was now a choice. Marius fled, but he did not die. He came back. In the year 87, while Sulla was in the east, Marius returned to Rome with his own army and conducted a purge of Sulla's supporters. The killings this time were more extensive. Senators who had opposed Marius were hunted down in the streets. Their heads were displayed in the forum. Marius himself died of illness shortly after this return to power. But the precedent had deepened. Roman politics now included, as a regular tool, the mass killing of political opponents. Then Sulla came back. He returned from the east in the year 83 at the head of his victorious army. The war against him lasted about a year. When he had won, he declared himself dictator, a constitutional office that had not been used for more than a century, and he did something that made the earlier killings look limited. He invented the proscription. A proscription was a list. Sulla had the list posted in the forum, publicly and openly. On the list were the names of men whom Sulla had declared outlaws. Their property was forfeit. Their descendants were barred from political office, and any Roman citizen who killed them would receive a reward from the state. The lists were not static. Names were added as Sulla or his associates thought of new enemies. Men who had done nothing wrong found themselves proscribed because someone wanted their property, because someone held an old grudge. The ancient sources do not agree precisely on how many Romans were killed. Appian gives figures that suggest about 40 senators and 1,600 equestrians in the initial lists. Plutarch records different numbers. Modern estimates, drawing on the various accounts, place the total dead in the senatorial and equestrian classes somewhere between 1,500 and a few thousand, with an unknown larger number of lesser victims. Whatever the precise count, the effect on the city was transformative. Cicero was a young man in Rome during all of this. He was studying rhetoric, developing his skills, preparing himself for a public career in a city where the heads of senators were nailed to posts in the forum. He had to walk past those posts. Everyone did. The forum, during the proscriptions, was not a place you could look at without seeing what had been done there. What does a young man absorb from an experience like that? The historical record does not give us Cicero's direct response to these specific years, but his surviving writings from later in his life return repeatedly to certain themes that suggest what the experience had planted in him. He writes, again and again, about the rule of law as the foundation of civilized life. He writes about the importance of institutional procedures. He writes about the special horror of civil war, of Romans killing Romans, of the breakdown that occurs when political disagreement passes the threshold into mass killing. These are not abstract philosophical positions in his work. They have the weight of conviction that comes from having watched the alternative in person. Sulla's dictatorship produced a conservative reform of the Roman constitution. He strengthened the Senate. He weakened the tribunes of the people. Then, In the year 79, he did something almost no one expected. He voluntarily gave up the dictatorship. He retired to his estate in Campania. He died the following year, apparently of natural causes. The peaceful retirement and death of Sulla did not solve the problem Sulla's career had revealed. The problem was that the Roman political system no longer had a reliable way of preventing what Sulla had done. A general with a loyal army could now take the city. The only thing stopping future generals from doing this was the absence of sufficient motivation, which was not a safeguard that could be counted on. Every ambitious Roman politician of the following generation grew up understanding this. The old unwritten rules about what could not be done had been erased. New rules had not replaced them. Cicero understood it too, but he understood it differently from most of his contemporaries. Where others saw the breakdown of the old rules as an opportunity to accumulate personal power, Cicero, to judge from everything he later wrote, saw it as a disaster that had to be resisted. The Republic, in his view, was not merely a set of institutions that existed to be captured by the person most capable of capturing them. The Republic was the only thing that stood between Rome and the systematic political murder he had witnessed as a young man. He carried this conviction into his career and never put it down. It would drive him to the greatest achievements of his life. It would also, in the end, ensure that his story ended the way the story of anyone who stood in the way of sufficient power in Rome eventually ended. In the year 80, Sulla was still alive, and a young advocate with an unusual name and a provincial accent was about to take a case that no sensible person in Rome would have taken. Chapter 3. The young voice who dared to stand up to Sulla. A man named Sextus Roscius had been murdered one evening in the year 81 before the Common Era. He was a prosperous landowner from the town of Ameria in Umbria. He had travelled to Rome on business. He was returning to his lodgings after dinner when he was attacked in the street and killed. In the normal course of Roman criminal investigation, the death of a wealthy provincial landowner would have been handled through the ordinary procedures. There would have been inquiries in Ameria. There would have been attention paid to the question of who had most benefited from the victim's death. But the ordinary procedures were not what happened. What happened instead was something that illustrated how completely Sulla's dictatorship had distorted even the routine workings of Roman law. The victim's name was added to the proscription lists. This was done after his death, which was already irregular. Adding a man's name to the list after he had been murdered allowed his property to be confiscated by the state and sold at auction. The property was extensive, about 13 farms of considerable value. The purchaser of the property was a man named Lucius Cornelius Chrysogonus. Chrysogonus was a Greek freedman who had been freed by Sulla himself. He was, at this moment, one of the most powerful men in Rome. He handled large portions of the financial operations surrounding the proscriptions. He bought the estates of the murdered Sextus Roscius for 2,000 sesterces. The estates were worth somewhere around 6 million sesterces. This was not a commercial transaction. It was the mechanism by which the property of a murdered man was transferred to a favourite of the dictator at a fraction of its value. But there was a complication. The murdered man had a son, also named Sextus Roscius, who had a legal claim to inherit. As long as the son was alive and free, the transaction was vulnerable to legal challenge. Our primary source for what happened next is Cicero's own speech defending the son, which means we are seeing these events through the lens of the advocate who who was trying to save his client's life. Read with that caution. The account is this. 2 cousins of the victim, who had been involved in long-standing disputes with him over property, joined forces with Chrysogonus. They produced a criminal charge against the son, accusing him of having murdered his own father. If the son could be convicted of parricide, he would be executed in the traditional Roman manner for that crime, which was gruesome enough that I will not describe it here in detail. His claim to the property would be extinguished. The confiscation would become permanent. Everyone involved in the scheme would benefit. The younger Sextus Roscius needed a lawyer. No established lawyer in Rome would take the case. This was not because the case lacked merit. It was because taking the case meant attacking Chrysogonus. Attacking Chrysogonus meant attacking the dictator's interests, or, at the very least, being perceived as attacking them. The senior advocates of Rome, the men who had worked out comfortable accommodations with the new regime, were not going to take a case that might put them on the wrong side of Sulla for the sake of a provincial landowner's son. The case came to Cicero. He was 26 years old. He had no established reputation, no powerful family to protect him, no network of political allies who could shield him from retribution. He had only his training, his ambition, and the calculation that taking the case might either make his career or end his life. He was young enough to be willing to find out which. He took it. The trial took place in the year 80. The courtroom was an open-air platform in the Roman Forum, with the jury seated on benches and the crowd of spectators standing around them. Picture the morning. The winter light slanting across the Forum at an angle. Braziers burning along the edges of the open court where men warmed their hands. The smell of wood smoke and damp stone. The low murmur of a crowd that had gathered because word had spread that something unusual was about to happen. A provincial advocate almost nobody had heard of was going to stand up and accuse the freedman of Sulla. The crowd had come to see if the young man had any idea what he was doing. Cicero stepped forward. He was thin, still developing the physical presence that would later characterize him. His voice, according to his own later description of this period, was higher and more strained than it would become. He was wearing the plain tunic of a man without inherited rank. He was 26 years old, and he was about to attack the most powerful freedman in Rome in the middle of a city where men had been killed for less. He began to speak. The speech survives. It is one of the most remarkable documents to come down to us from the late Republic. The speech does what the case required. It exposes the motive of the cousins. It demonstrates the implausibility of the charge. It builds, carefully, to the identification of Chrysogonus as the true beneficiary of the scheme, and then it does something that no one in the courtroom expected. It attacks Chrysogonus directly. It names him. It describes his lifestyle, his arrogance, his accumulated wealth from the proscriptions. It contrasts the freedman's luxury with the suffering he has caused. In the Roman Forum, with Sulla's dictatorship still in force, in a political environment where men had been killed for far less, a 26-year-old provincial was saying out loud what almost everyone had been whispering for months, and Cicero did something even more dangerous. He drew a careful distinction. He did not attack Sulla. He praised Sulla. In fact, at certain points in the speech, describing him as a great man who could not possibly be aware of the outrages being committed in his name by his subordinates. This was a rhetorical move of considerable sophistication. It gave Sulla a face-saving exit. If the dictator wished He could accept the premise that Chrysogonus had acted without his knowledge, disown the freedman's actions, and allow the court to rule in favour of Roscius without any loss of political face. The calculation worked. Roscius was acquitted. Chrysogonus disappeared from the historical record shortly after. Sulla did nothing to Cicero, but Cicero did not wait to find out whether the dictator's restraint would continue. Shortly after the trial, he left Rome and travelled to Greece. He had suffered from a thin constitution and frequent fatigue for most of his life. By his own later account, his voice had been damaged by the strain of the kind of passionate oratory he had delivered in the Roscius case. Rest and further training in Greece were, by this account, medical necessities. It was probably also true that Rome was not, for the moment, a safe place for the young man who had publicly exposed the corruption at the heart of Sulla's regime. The departure for Greece was strategically sensible, regardless of what any doctor had recommended. Cicero left Rome a known man. People in Rome now knew who he was. They knew he had a voice. They knew he had the courage, or the foolhardiness, to use that voice against powerful interests. He boarded a ship for Greece. The dictator was still alive, and the young advocate who had just demonstrated, in the most public setting the Roman world could provide, that a single voice could matter, was about to spend several years discovering what lay beneath the techniques of persuasion he had already mastered. Chapter 4. The Years in Greece and the Shaping of a Soul. The ship that carried Cicero east in the year 79 before the Common Era was taking him away from the city where his ambitions lived and toward the places where the ideas that shaped those ambitions had been born. For an educated Roman of his generation, this was not merely a journey. It was a pilgrimage. The crossing took several days. Picture him standing at the rail of the merchant vessel, the coastline of Italy falling behind him in the morning light, the sea stretching out in every direction, the wind carrying the smell of salt and tar, and the unfamiliar scent of the lands he was moving toward. He was 27 years old. He had never been so far from home. His first stop was Athens. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Athens was a shadow of the city it had been during its great democratic period 4 centuries earlier. It was no longer a significant military or commercial power. What it was, still, was the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world. The philosophical schools, founded by Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, and the Stoics all still operated there. Students came from across the civilized world to study under the teachers who maintained these traditions. The city lived on its reputation, and on the quiet patience of a place whose greatest days were behind it. Picture Cicero walking through Athens in the autumn of his first year there. The narrow streets where the stones had been worn smooth by 6 centuries of feet, the smell of olive oil in the libraries where students read by lamplight, the marble of the Parthenon on the Acropolis above the city, catching the late sun and turning gold at the end of the day, the sound of Greek being spoken on every side. Not the careful Greek of Roman schoolrooms, but the living language of a living city. The distant cry of gulls from the harbour at Piraeus. He threw himself into the intellectual life of Athens with the same intensity that had characterized his studies in Rome. He attended lectures at the Academy, the school founded by Plato more than 300 years earlier. The head of the Academy at this time was a philosopher named Philo of Larissa, with whom Cicero had already studied briefly. In Athens, he also studied with a philosopher named Antiochus of Ascalon. He attended the lectures of the Epicurean school and of various Stoic teachers. His approach to philosophy, then and throughout his life, was not to commit himself to a single school, but to move among them, absorbing what each had to offer. This was unusual for the ancient world, where most serious students identified themselves firmly with one tradition. Cicero preferred to keep multiple traditions in conversation. What he was looking for was not only philosophical content, he was looking for something harder to name. He had already demonstrated, in the Roscius case, that he could speak with power. What he did not yet have, or did not yet have fully, was the depth of mind that separated a great orator from a merely clever one. The rhetorical techniques he had mastered in Rome were tools. They could be deployed in the service of almost any argument. What made the difference between using those tools well and using them corruptly was the quality of the person wielding them. And the quality of a person, as he would later write, was shaped by what that person had read, thought about, and wrestled with in the long, solitary work of understanding. So he read. He wrote. He practiced declamation under the guidance of Greek masters who had been teaching oratory for decades. The days had a rhythm. In the morning, de lectures. In the afternoon, private reading. Often in the libraries, where scrolls were kept in wooden cases and brought out at request. In the evening, meals with other students, conversation that went on late into the night, lamplight and wine, and the particular kind of intellectual friendship that forms between young people studying the same difficult material far from home. He began to change in ways that the people around him noticed. He was less quick to speak. He listened more. When he did speak, his arguments had a different weight than they had carried before. After Athens, he travelled to Asia Minor, visiting cities along the coast where other Greek rhetorical schools operated. He studied with various teachers there, and then he came to Rhodes. Rhodes sat in the eastern Mediterranean, an island of stone and olive groves, and in the 1st century before the Common Era it was home to one of the most respected schools of rhetoric in the Greek world. The teacher there was a man named Apollonius Molon. Molon had earlier made visits to Rome and had developed a reputation as one of the most rigorous and demanding teachers available. When Cicero arrived in Rhodes, Molon was the most sought-after instructor in the region. In the account Plutarch would later preserve, which may owe something to the kind of literary elaboration that attaches to the early years of famous men, Cicero performed for Molon as a test of his existing skills. He delivered a speech in the Greek style, drawing on everything he had learned. The other students present were impressed. Molon, according to the account, sat in silence for some time afterward. When he finally spoke, he said, in effect, that he admired Cicero, but grieved for Greece, because he could see the arts of speech passing from Greek hands into Roman ones. Whether Molon actually said this, or whether this is a story that grew up later to mark the symbolic moment of the transfer, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the underlying assessment turned out to be accurate. Cicero was in the process of becoming the person who would, more than any other individual, transfer the accumulated learning of the Greek rhetorical tradition into Latin and into the active political life of the Roman Republic. Under Molon's guidance, Cicero worked on a more practical problem as well. His speaking style in Rome had been intense, rapide, and emotionally charged. This style had strained his voice and contributed to the exhaustion that had been part of his reason for leaving Rome. Molon taught him to modulate, to vary his pace, to conserve his vocal resources for the moments when full power was required, to build arguments through gradation rather than sustained intensity. Cicero would later credit this training with having saved his career, or at least his voice. The man who returned from Greece would speak differently from the young advocate who had left. He would still be capable of the full emotional force when the moment required it, but he would know how to get there, and when. While Cicero was in Greece, events in his personal life were also taking their shape. Sometime during these years, though the exact date is uncertain in the sources, he was married. Her name was Terentia. She came from a family of considerable wealth and social standing, and she brought a substantial dowry to the marriage. For Cicero, whose family was comfortable but not rich, this was a significant material advantage. For Terentia, the marriage offered connection to a rising talent whose prospects were increasingly promising. Roman marriages in this period were generally arranged for reasons of property and political alliance rather than romantic attraction. What is clear from the evidence that survives, particularly from Cicero's letters written decades later, is that the marriage developed into something more than a practical arrangement. He wrote to her with an intimacy and a reliance that suggests genuine partnership. She managed his affairs in Rome during his frequent absences. The marriage would last for more than 30 years, and while it would eventually end in divorce, for most of Cicero's public life, Terentia was an essential part of how he functioned. Their first child, a daughter named Tullia, was born during this period or shortly after. The relationship between Cicero and Tullia would become one of the most documented and most tender father-daughter relationships in the surviving ancient record. He seems to have adored her with a completeness that is visible throughout his correspondence across decades. But that is a story for later. Cicero returned to Rome in the year 77 before the Common Era. He had been away for about 2 years. He was 29 years old. He had been trained by the best teachers the Greek world could offer. He had developed a rhetorical style that combined the full force of Roman tradition with the refinement of Greek technique. He had married well. He had a young daughter. He had recovered his health, and Sulla, the dictator who had made his return to Rome potentially dangerous, had died while Cicero was abroad. The political situation he returned to was therefore different from the one he had left. The immediate threat of personal retribution was gone. The institutions of the Republic, in the form Sulla had reorganized them, were still in place. The memory of the proscriptions was fresh enough to discourage open political violence, at least for the moment. Into this relatively stable environment, Cicero re-entered public life. He did so with a clear plan. He intended to climb the formal ladder of Roman political office. He intended to reach the consulship, the highest elected office in the Republic. He intended to do it without inherited rank, without family backing, without any of the shortcuts that men of established families could use. The training was complete. The voice was ready. The work could now begin. Chapter 5. Climbing to the top without wings. The Roman system of political advancement was a ladder with specific rungs that had to be climbed in a specific order. A man who wished to reach the consulship had to first serve as quaestor, then as aedile or tribune, then as praetor, and only after those offices could he stand for consul. Minimum ages applied at each stage. The minimum age for consul was 42. Cicero held each office in the first year he was legally eligible for it. This pattern, called suo anno in Latin, meaning in his own year, was the highest achievement in Roman political life. It indicated a man whose career had proceeded without delays, without failures in elections. For a new man from a provincial family to do this was almost without precedent. His first office was the quaestorship, which he held in the year 75, before the Common Era, at the age of 30. Quaestors were financial officers assigned either to Rome itself or to a provincial governor. Cicero drew the assignment of Lilybaeum in Sicily. Sicily was an important assignment, but not a glamorous one. It was a grain-producing province essential to feeding the city of Rome. The quaestor's work involved managing the collection and shipment of grain, handling the legal and financial affairs of Roman citizens living on the island, and generally supporting the governor's administration. Picture him there. In his year of quaestorship, the Sicilian light, whiter and sharper than Italian light, the small harbour at Lilybaeum, where the grain ships waited, the long ledger books in which he recorded the transactions of the province, the slow evenings in the stone rooms assigned to the Roman administrator, reading by lamplight, writing letters home, the unfamiliar taste of the local wine, the sound of a language, the Greek of the Sicilian coastal cities, that reminded him every day of the years he had spent in Athens and Rhodes. Cicero did the routine work. He did it well. The ancient sources suggest that he was unusually honest in his financial administration, and that he treated the Sicilians he encountered with respect, rather than the casual contempt that many Roman administrators displayed toward provincials. The Sicilians noticed. This would matter later in ways Cicero could not have anticipated at the time. When his year as quaestor ended, Cicero returned to Rome. He expected, by his own later admission, that his service in Sicily would be widely known and appreciated in the capital. It was not. He discovered, upon his return, that most people in Rome had simply not been paying attention to what a quaestor was doing in Lilybaeum. He recorded this discovery in his later writings as a moment of useful correction. He had, he admitted, overestimated how much his distant service would be noticed. He took from this the lesson that he needed to be physically present in Rome as much as possible. He spent the years after his quaestorship building his legal practice, appearing in courts, and making himself present in every venue that produced public attention. The case that would transform his career arrived in the year 70. A group of Sicilians came to Rome seeking an advocate to prosecute their former governor. The governor's name was Gaius Verres. His 3-year administration of the province had been, even by the loose standards of Roman provincial government, astonishingly corrupt. Verres had systematically looted Sicily. He had extorted money from wealthy Sicilians through manipulation of the legal system. He had confiscated artworks from public temples and private collections, shipping them to Rome to decorate his own properties. He had manipulated the grain collection system to skim off profits. He had sold offices, accepted bribes, and conducted himself as if the province existed for his personal enrichment. Roman provincial governors were generally expected to return from their posts wealthier than they had arrived. The traditional view was that a governor's province was a legitimate source of personal income, within certain loosely defined limits. What made Verres remarkable was that he had exceeded even the generous latitude that custom allowed. The Sicilians wanted Cicero to be the prosecutor. They wanted him specifically because of his earlier service in Lilybaeum, because they trusted him. because they believed he would actually pursue the case rather than arrange a comfortable settlement. The case was both an opportunity and a significant risk. Verres was wealthy. He had defenders who included the most prominent advocate in Rome, Quintus Hortensius Hortalus, the man who had been considered the undisputed leading orator of the generation just before Cicero's. Verres also had allies in the Senate who would use every procedural tool available to delay and obstruct the prosecution. Cicero took the case. He went to Sicily personally to gather evidence. He travelled across the province, interviewing witnesses, collecting documents, reconstructing the specific transactions through which Verres had extracted his wealth. He did this within 50 days, a remarkable pace given the distances involved. The trial presented a particular challenge. Under Roman procedure, prosecutors typically delivered long opening speeches that laid out the entire case. This procedure suited Hortensius, the defense advocate, because it gave maximum scope for rhetorical delay. If the opening speeches could be extended long enough, the trial could be pushed into the next year, when a different set of magistrates friendly to Verres would take office. Cicero anticipated this strategy and defeated it through a procedural innovation. Instead of delivering the long opening speech the defense was expecting, he gave a brief introductory speech and then moved immediately to the presentation of witnesses and evidence. He laid the case out directly. The evidence was overwhelming. After 9 days of this devastating presentation, Hortensius and Verres recognized that continuing would be pointless. Verres went into voluntary exile before the trial could reach its formal conclusion. Cicero had prepared a second set of speeches, 5 in total, that he would have delivered had the trial continued in its normal form. When the trial ended early, he published these speeches as written works. Together with his opening arguments, they constitute what is called the Verrine Orations, one of the most extensive surviving accounts of Roman provincial corruption ever produced. The effect on his career was transformative. He had publicly defeated Hortensius. He had done so in a case that had attracted enormous public attention. He had demonstrated, in the most visible way possible, that a new man from Arpinum could out-argue the best advocate the Roman aristocracy had to offer. The remaining offices of the cursus honorum followed. He was elected aedile in the year 69. He was elected praetor in the year 66. At age 40, again in the first year, he was legally eligible. His year as praetor included his first major political speech, the speech in support of a law granting Pompey the command against Mithridates. After his praetorship, Cicero was eligible for a provincial governorship. He declined it. Most Roman politicians regarded provincial governorships as one of the primary rewards of the cursus honorum. Cicero skipped this step. He remained in Rome, building his legal practice, preparing for the consular election of 64. The consular election of that year was contested by 7 candidates. The most politically significant of them, besides Cicero, was Lucius Sergius Catilina, a patrician of ancient family who had accumulated a reputation for violence, debt, and questionable associations. In any normal year, he would have been the front-runner. Cicero won. He was elected consul for the year 63. The first new man to hold the office in more than 30 years. He was 42 years old, exactly at the minimum age. He had climbed the entire ladder of Roman political life in the first year he was eligible at each step. He had reached the top and the man who had finished behind him, angry, indebted, and increasingly desperate, was already planning what he would do next. Chapter 6. The Catiline Conspiracy. Lucius Sergius Catilina was not the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully. He came from the gens Sergia, one of the oldest patrician families in Rome. For centuries his ancestors had held the highest offices in the Republic. To lose the consulship to a new man from Arpinum was, by his own estimation, an intolerable inversion of the natural order. Catiline had problems that went deeper than wounded pride. He was drowning in debt. The scale of it, according to the surviving sources, was enormous even by the standards of the Roman aristocracy. He had borrowed heavily to fund his political career. His creditors were closing in. Catiline was a patrician descending towards something like civic extinction, and he knew it. He tried again. In the year 63, the year of Cicero's consulship, Catiline stood for the consulship of the following year. The election was held in the summer. Cicero, as presiding consul, managed the election process. By this point, rumours had begun to circulate about what Catiline might do if he lost again. Cicero took no chances. He appeared at the electoral assembly wearing a visible breastplate under his toga, surrounded by a bodyguard of young aristocrats. The symbolism was direct. Catiline lost again. What followed over the subsequent months is one of the best documented episodes in late Republican history. According to the accounts preserved by Cicero himself and by the historian Sallust, writing a generation later, Catiline began organizing a conspiracy. The plan, as it took shape through the autumn, involved multiple elements. A military force was being assembled in Etruria, north of Rome, under a former Sullan officer named Manlius. Armed supporters were gathering inside the city itself. The conspirators were identifying specific targets for assassination, with Cicero at the top of the list. Cicero learned of these preparations through an intelligence network that he appears to have been building for some time. By his own later account, one of his sources was a woman named Fulvia, who was the mistress of one of the conspirators and who passed information through channels, the details of which are not fully documented. He went to the Senate on the 21st of October. He reported specific intelligence, including the date on which the uprising in Etruria would begin. The Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate, which authorized the consuls to take whatever measures were necessary to defend the state. The date Cicero had predicted passed, and the rising in Etruria began on schedule. Manlius was in arms. On the night of the 6th of November, according to Sallust's account, the inner circle of conspirators met at the house of a man named Laker. They discussed final plans. Two of them volunteered to kill Cicero the following morning. Cicero, in the account he himself would later give, learned of this plan through his informants before it could be carried out. When the would-be assassins arrived at his house, they were refused admission. Later that same day, Cicero convened the Senate in the temple of Jupiter Stator. Catiline had the audacity to attend. Picture the scene. The temple interior cold in the November morning, the senators arrayed on their benches, the incense rising from the altars at the front of the chamber, and Catiline walking in as if nothing had changed, taking his customary seat, expecting the session to proceed in the usual way. Cicero rose, and he delivered the speech that has been called, for 2,000 years. The first Catilinarian. The speech survives. It begins with a question that has become one of the most quoted sentences in Latin literature. How long, Jatiline, will you continue to abuse our patience? The speech proceeds to lay out the evidence Cicero had assembled. He described the meeting at Laca's house. He described the military preparations. He addressed Catiline directly, demanding that he leave the city. The effect, according to the sources, was overwhelming. The senators present moved away from Catiline physically, leaving the benches around him empty. No one spoke in his defence. When he attempted to respond, he was shouted down. He left the Senate that evening and left Rome that night, travelling north to join the army in Etruria. But the conspiracy in Rome was not over. Several senior conspirators remained in the city. The most important of these was Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura, a former consul who was serving as praetor at this moment. Cicero needed evidence. The evidence arrived through a sequence of events that reads almost like a scene from fiction, but that the ancient sources describe consistently. A delegation from a Gallic tribe called the Allobroges was in Rome. The conspirators, in what appears to have been a serious error of judgment, approached the Allobroges and tried to recruit them as allies. The Allobrogan ambassadors, uncertain what to do, consulted with their patron in Rome, who brought the matter immediately to Cicero. Cicero instructed the Allobroges to play along, to ask for written commitments from the conspirators, and to arrange to leave Rome on a particular night carrying the documents. The plan worked. On the night of the 2nd of December, the Allobroges left Rome. At the Mulvian Bridge, a force organized by Cicero intercepted them and seized the letters. The conspirators had signed their names and affixed their personal seals to documents that committed them in writing to treason. On the 3rd of December, Cicero produced the letters before the Senate. The major conspirators still in Rome were arrested. The letters were opened in the presence of each accused conspirator. The contents were read aloud. The evidence was incontrovertible. And now Cicero faced the decision that would define his consulship and, in the long run, define his life. What was to be done with the prisoners? The legal situation was complicated. Roman citizens had the traditional right, established by ancient law, to appeal to the people before any capital punishment could be imposed. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum authorized emergency measures, but whether it could actually override the citizens' right of appeal was legally uncertain. This was not a minor technicality. It was the foundation on which centuries of Roman civic protection rested. Cicero convened the Senate on the 5th of December to debate the question. The debate, which survives in substantial reconstruction through Sallust's account, was one of the most consequential in Roman history. The first major speaker was the consul-elect Silanus, who argued for execution. Then Gaius Julius Caesar spoke. Caesar argued against execution. He proposed instead that the prisoners be distributed among Italian towns and held in custody there. His argument was partly legal, emphasizing the right of citizens to due process, and partly practical. He warned that executing citizens without trial would establish a precedent that could be used against other Romans in the future. The warning would prove accurate. Then Marcus Porcius Cato rose. Cato was a younger senator, known for his austere manner and his identification with the traditional values of the old republic. He argued with considerable force that the conspirators had forfeited their rights by taking up arms against the state. Cato's speech turned the debate. The Senate voted for execution. Cicero carried out the sentence that same evening. The ancient sources describe him walking through the streets to the Tullianum, the underground execution chamber at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, escorting Lentulus there, watching while the strangling was done. When Cicero emerged to inform the crowd waiting in the forum of what had been done, he used a single word: vixerunt. They have lived. The past tense communicated what had happened without the crude directness of announcing the deaths. The immediate political effect was enormous. The crowd accompanied Cicero home that night in a torchlight procession. Many Romans hailed him as the saviour of the Republic. The Senate voted him the title Pater Patriae, father of his country, a designation that had not been granted to anyone before. The armed force in Etruria, now cut off from its urban support, was eventually defeated in battle the following January. Catiline died fighting in that final engagement. In his own self-understanding, and in the understanding of many Romans at that moment, he had saved Rome. It is worth noting, before we move on, that modern scholarship has not always accepted this self-assessment at face value. The British classicist Mary Beard, among others, has questioned whether the conspiracy was as extensive or as immediately dangerous as Cicero's account. Our primary source suggests the evidence against the arrested conspirators was real, but the framing of the crisis as an existential threat requiring the extraordinary measures Cicero took was, to some degree, Cicero's own framing. We cannot know, from this distance, exactly how close Rome came to what Cicero said it came close to. What we can know is that the warning Caesar had delivered in the Senate debate, the warning that executing citizens without trial would set a precedent that could be used against other Romans in the future, was not forgotten. It was stored. It was carried forward by men who had reasons, now or in the future, to use it against Cicero. The moment of greatest triumph contained within it the seed of the catastrophe that would arrive 5 years later. Cicero did not yet see this. He could not see it. He was walking home from the Tullianum in a torchlight procession, believing he had saved his country. The reckoning would come. Chapter 7. Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, and the man who was not invited. The men who ran Rome in the years after Cicero's consulship were not primarily interested in the institutional question of whether the Republic survived. They were interested in the more immediate question of how power within the Republic could be arranged to suit their individual ambitions. By the late 60s and early 50s, before the Common Era, 3 men had emerged whose private arrangements would determine the course of Roman politics more completely than any Senate debate. The oldest of them was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus had been one of Sulla's supporters during the Civil War. He had enriched himself enormously during the proscriptions by acquiring confiscated property at auction, and had continued to build his fortune through various business operations over the following decades. By the time of the events we are describing, he was reputed to be the wealthiest man in Rome. He had also defeated the slave uprising led by Spartacus in the years 73 to 71. Crassus was not a particularly charismatic figure. What he had was money, and in Roman politics, money could purchase almost anything that was not directly protected by law. The second of them was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, called Pompey the Great. Pompey was the most successful Roman general of his generation. He had campaigned successfully in Spain, had cleared the Mediterranean of piracy in a remarkable 3-month operation, and had then conducted the eastern campaigns that had finally ended the long war against Mithridates, and had reorganized the entire eastern frontier of the Roman world. When he returned to Rome in the year 62, he was at the peak of his military reputation. He expected, reasonably, that the Senate would honour his commitments to his veterans and ratify his eastern settlements. The Senate declined to do either of these things quickly. Pompey spent the next several years frustrated by senatorial obstruction, looking for allies who might help him force through the political outcomes he wanted. The third was Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was younger than the other two, not yet at the peak of his career during the events we have just described, but rising steadily. He came from an ancient patrician family that claimed descent from Venus, but the family had been in political decline for several generations, and Caesar had no great inherited wealth. What he had was extraordinary ability, et visible charme, and an ambition that the surviving sources suggest was visible to those who paid close attention from quite early in his career. The three of them made a private arrangement. The details of the initial agreement are not recorded with complete clarity. What is clear is the general shape. Caesar would run for consul. Crassus and Pompey would both support his candidacy. Once in office, Caesar would use his consular authority to pass the legislation that his partners needed. In return for this service, Caesar would receive, after his consulship, a significant provincial command that would give him the military opportunity he needed to build his own power base. This arrangement is called, in modern historical writing, the First Triumvirate. The ancient sources do not use that term. It was not a formal alliance with a name. It was a private understanding among three men who had agreed to coordinate. But it was, in its practical effects, the most important political development in Rome since Sulla's dictatorship. Three men who could act together could outvote the Senate, buy the elections, intimidate opponents, and move legislation through the popular assemblies without the senatorial scrutiny that had traditionally been required. Caesar was elected consul for the year 59. The legislation he pushed through during that year, over the objections of his fellow consul and a significant faction of the Senate, fulfilled the promises he had made to his partners. By the end of the year, the informal triumvirate had demonstrated that it could effectively govern Rome, whatever the Senate chose to do about it. Cicero had not been invited to join. The reasons why he was not invited are worth thinking about carefully, because they tell us something important about where Cicero fit in the Roman political landscape of this period. Caesar had actually approached him. According to Cicero's own later correspondence, Caesar had sent feelers exploring whether Cicero might be interested in some kind of alliance. The terms are not clearly described in the surviving evidence. What is clear is that Cicero declined. He declined not because he failed to recognize the power that the three men were assembling, but precisely because he did recognize it and understood what it meant for the Republic. Aligning himself with the triumvirate would have required him to lend his rhetorical and political weight to a private arrangement that was, in his assessment, an assault on the constitutional order he had spent his life defending. This decision was consistent with everything Cicero had believed since his youth. It was also, in the pragmatic political terms of the moment, a decision that made his position progressively more isolated. Picture him during these years. He is at his desk in Rome, late in the afternoon, the light falling through the high windows of his study on the Palatine Hill. A wax tablet is open in front of him. He is writing, as he has been writing almost every day for years, to his closest friend Atticus, who is far away in Athens or in Epirus. The letter will describe the latest manoeuvres of the triumvirate, the latest failure of the Senate to resist them, the latest calculation Cicero has made about what he himself should do. The letters from this period, which survive, are one of the most remarkable records of a private mind engaging with public events that the ancient world has left us. The Optimates, the senatorial faction that defined itself as the defender of traditional institutions, were natural allies for Cicero ideologically. But the Optimates also included many men who had resented Cicero's rise as a new man. The great aristocratic families treated him with a politeness that fell short of genuine acceptance. He was useful. He was admired. He was not one of them. The populares, the faction that aligned with Caesar, were ideologically opposed to Cicero and increasingly suspicious of him. Caesar himself, for all that he was personally cordial with Cicero, was not going to share serious political leadership with a man who disagreed with him about the fundamental direction of Roman politics. So Cicero occupied a kind of political middle ground, respected by many, controlled by neither faction, influential through his oratory and his reputation, but without the concrete power base that either Caesar or the hard-line Optimates could deploy. He believed, and he continued to believe for several more years, that a wise and moderate leader could still play a decisive role in Roman politics by standing above the factions. This belief does not appear to have been a delusion. There had been earlier periods in Roman history when such moderate leadership had been possible. The problem was that the period Cicero was now living through was not one of those periods. The three men of the triumvirate had rearranged the political landscape in such a way that neutrality was no longer a genuine option. You were aligned with them, or you were eventually crushed by them. He did not see this clearly enough. Early enough? He saw it partially. There was also, in this period, a specific personal enemy taking shape against him. His name was Publius Clodius Pulcher. Clodius came from one of the most ancient and powerful patrician families of Rome. He had been involved, in the year 62, in a notorious scandal. He had disguised himself as a woman and sneaked into the rites of the Bona Dea, a religious ceremony that admitted only women, which had been taking place at Caesar's house. His motives, which the ancient sources describe variously, were reportedly connected to an affair he was pursuing within Caesar's household. The scandal was enormous. Clodius was put on trial for sacrilege. At the trial, Clodius attempted to establish an alibi. He claimed to have been far from Rome on the night in question. Cicero appeared as a witness for the prosecution and testified that he had seen Clodius in Rome that day, destroying the alibi. Clodius was ultimately acquitted, reportedly through the bribing of the jury, but the testimony had made him Cicero's personal enemy in a way that would not be forgotten. Clodius did not forget. He spent the next several years preparing a specific form of revenge. He arranged to have himself transferred from patrician to plebeian status, a complicated procedure that required adoption by a plebeian family, so that he could stand for the office of tribune of the people. The tribunate was a plebeian office that carried the power to propose legislation directly to the popular assemblies and to veto actions by other magistrates. It was a tool of enormous potential use against political opponents. Clodius was elected tribune for the year 58. By this point, Caesar had left Rome for his province of Gaul, where he would spend the next 9 years conducting the campaigns that would transform his military reputation. Before he left, he had arranged for Clodius's elevation to plebeian status. Caesar did not personally direct what Clodius would do next, but Caesar had cleared the path, and Clodius now had the authority and the motivation to use it. Cicero was about to discover what it felt like to be the target of a coordinated political destruction rather than the man conducting one. The discovery would take him, within months, from his position as the honoured former consul to a hunted exile, watching his property burn from a foreign city, wondering whether the life he had built on the foundation of his voice had been, in the end, a structure built on nothing that could hold. Chapter 8. The years in exile. The attack came quickly. Clodius took office as tribune on the 10th of December in the year 59 before the Common Era, and within weeks he had introduced a series of laws designed to consolidate his power and to prepare the ground for what he intended to do to Cicero. One of these laws provided free grain to the urban poor, which earned him enormous popularity among the most politically active crowds in the city. Another restored the collegia, the neighbourhood associations that had been restricted some years earlier because they had been used for organised political violence. Clodius reorganised these associations into what amounted to personal gangs that could be deployed to intimidate opponents and dominate the streets of Rome. Then, in early 58, he introduced the law that he had been preparing. The law did not name Cicero. It did not need to. It declared that any magistrate who had put to death a Roman citizen without due process should be banished from Italy. Everyone knew what this meant. The only person in recent Roman memory who had executed citizens under the kind of circumstances the law described was Cicero, acting under the authority of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum during the suppression of the Catiline conspiracy 5 years earlier. The law was retroactive in its practical effect. The warning Caesar had delivered in the Senate debate of 63 was now being fulfilled. Against Cicero himself, Cicero's response was to organize a public demonstration of support. He changed into mourning clothes, as Romans did when seeking sympathy in serious legal trouble. He appeared in the Forum in this state, and large numbers of equestrians and even some senators also put on mourning clothes in solidarity with him. The consuls of the year, who had been given provincial commands by Clodius in exchange for their non-interference, responded by issuing an edict forbidding senators to appear in mourning dress. The institutional machinery of the Republic was actively being used against the man who had believed himself to be its defender. Cicero sought help from the people he thought might provide it. He went to Pompey. Picture the scene. An older man arriving at the house of a former ally, standing in the atrium while a servant goes to announce him, waiting in the cool quiet of the entrance hall, the morning light falling through the opening in the roof onto the pool below, the sound of water, and gradually, from the lengthening silence and the eventual return of the servant with some polite impossibility, the understanding, the man he has come to see has chosen not to receive him. Plutarch preserves the tradition that Pompey actually left his own house by a back door to avoid the encounter. Whether that specific detail is historical or a later embellishment, the broader outcome is not in doubt. The great general had concluded that defending Cicero would cost more than it was worth to him in his current political calculations. Cicero stood in the atrium a little longer. Then he went home. He consulted with close friends and advisers. Cato advised him to stand his ground and trust that the law could not actually be enforced against him. Others advised the opposite. Cicero agonized over the decision. His correspondence from this period makes clear that the prospect of being attacked in his own house or in the streets of Rome was terrifying to him in ways that no amount of philosophical preparation had rendered manageable. He chose to leave. In late March or early April of 58, he departed Rome voluntarily, before the law was formally passed, but after it had become clear that it would pass, Clodius pursued with supplementary legislation. A second law was passed that specifically named Cicero, declared him an exile, confiscated his property, and forbade anyone within 400 miles of Italy to provide him shelter. The property confiscation was carried out with particular spite. Cicero's house on the Palatine Hill was demolished. Clodius arranged for a shrine to the goddess Libertas to be constructed on the site, using parts of the demolished house as building materials. The choice of deity was a deliberate mockery. Cicero's villa at Tusculum, his country property near Rome, was also attacked and partially destroyed. His wife, Terentia, was forced to seek shelter in a temple of Vesta, where she was protected by the sanctity of the religious space, but where she lived in conditions of considerable distress. Cicero travelled east. He eventually arrived in the city of Thessalonica, in the Roman province of Macedonia, where he was given shelter by the quaestor Gnaeus Plancius, who was willing to risk the legal consequences of sheltering the exile. The months that followed were, by his own account, the darkest of his life. The letters he wrote during this period, particularly to Atticus and to his brother Quintus, are among the most emotionally exposed documents in Roman literature. They are not the letters of a Stoic philosopher maintaining equanimity under adverse conditions. They are the letters of a man who has been broken by what has happened to him, and who is writing to the few people in the world with whom he can admit it. He describes his grief in terms that are almost theatrical in their intensity. He writes of being unable to eat, of weeping uncontrollably at the memory of what he has lost. He reproaches himself for not having fought harder against the law. He reproaches his friends for not having done more to protect him. He describes his physical condition as wrecked, his mind as unable to function. His correspondence suggests a man whose psychological resources proved inadequate to the catastrophe that had befallen him. He had built his identity, or so his letters imply, on his public standing in Rome. His sense of himself, of his worth, of the meaning of his life, was thoroughly intertwined with his role in Roman public life. The removal of that role produced something close to a complete collapse. The work of building a philosophical framework that could separate inner worth from external position was still ahead of him. It would be developed most intensively in the writing he did in later periods of adversity. In the meantime, what seems to have saved him from the worst consequences of his own despair was the activity of his friends and family in Rome. Atticus remained loyal and active, working behind the scenes to build support for his recall. Terentia, despite her own difficult situation, organized visits to senators and their wives on his behalf. Quintus campaigned publicly for his return, and the political tide in Rome began to shift, because Clodius, having achieved his revenge on Cicero, quickly made himself inconvenient to the very men who had enabled him. Clodius's gangs, having demonstrated their effectiveness, began attacking Pompey as well. Pompey found himself effectively under house arrest at certain periods. The triumvirate's calculations shifted. If Clodius could not be controlled, he might need to be counterbalanced. And one way to counterbalance him was to recall Cicero. Another tribune, Titus Annius Milo, organized his own armed gangs to counter Clodius's. The streets of Rome in the late 50s, before the Common Era, were increasingly dominated by running battles between these organized groups. The normal civic life of the city was being replaced by something closer to a low-grade urban war. In August of the year 57, the Senate voted, under Pompey's influence, to recall Cicero. The vote in the Centuriate Assembly was reportedly nearly unanimous. On the 4th of September, Cicero landed at Brundisium, having been in exile for approximately 17 months. His journey from Brundisium back to Rome was a kind of reverse of his departure. At every major town along the way, crowds turned out to welcome him. When he reached Rome itself, he was met by an enormous public reception. The return was, in its public aspects, a triumph. But the man returning was not the same man who had left. The exile had done something to him that the subsequent years would not fully undo. He had learned, in a way that only direct experience could teach, how thin the margin was between the honoured statesman and the despised outcast. He had learned that his former friends would not necessarily protect him when the cost became serious. He had learned, though he would resist this lesson for years to come, that the republic he loved was no longer able to protect the men who served it most faithfully. Chapter 9. Returning, but no longer himself. There is an image that runs through Cicero's correspondence in the years after his return from exile, and it is the image of a man writing at his desk late into the night. Picture him at Tusculum, his beloved country villa 15 miles southeast of Rome. The house sat on a hillside among olive groves, with a view down toward the coastal plain. In the evenings, after the household had gone to bed, he would sit in his study with a single oil lamp burning on the table, a wax tablet before him, the stylus moving across the wax, the room quiet except for the small sounds of the house settling at night and the occasional call of an owl from the grove outside. He was writing to Atticus. Sometimes these letters were brief, a matter of household business or political gossip. More often they ran to several pages and covered the ground of his entire mental life. The quality of an olive crop, the behaviour of a difficult slave, the latest speech he had given, the news from Gaul, his worries about his daughter, the growing sense that the republic he had loved was slipping past the point of rescue. This was his life in the years between his return and the outbreak of the Civil War. He was still a senior statesman. He was still consulted. He still appeared in the Senate and in the courts. But the decisions that mattered were being made in private arrangements among Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Cicero was increasingly a commentator on events rather than a shaper of them, and so he wrote. The triumvirate renewed its arrangement in a meeting at Lucca in northern Italy in the year 56, and this renewal clarified for Cicero, if any clarification was still needed, that the three men's grip on Roman politics was not loosening. He accommodated. He softened his public positions on certain issues. His correspondence from this period is painfully honest about the compromise. He knew what he was doing. He defended it to Atticus on the grounds that any alternative was worse, that maintaining some presence in public life was more valuable than retreating completely. Whether this was true or merely self-serving is a question the historical record does not resolve. What the record does show is that his political influence in the years after his return was significantly less than it had been before his exile. He was still respected, but he was no longer at the centre. The years between his return and the outbreak of the Civil War are, in some ways, the most intellectually productive of his life. The man who could no longer shape events in the Senate redirected his energies towards shaping the life of the Roman mind through the written word. He did this with an intensity that produced, in a relatively short period, some of the most influential works of the Roman intellectual tradition. The first major product of this redirection was the treatise De Oratore, on the orator, which he completed in 55 before the Common Era. It is a dialogue set a generation earlier, in which several of the most distinguished Roman orators of that earlier period discuss the nature of oratory. The work is not merely a technical treatise. It is an argument for a particular conception of what a great speaker is, namely a person of broad culture, serious philosophical engagement, and genuine commitment to the public good, and it is simultaneously a kind of elegy for the political world in which such speakers had been able to operate. The second major work of this period was De Re Publica, on the Republic, completed around 51. This work was modelled loosely on Plato's Republic, but was thoroughly Roman in its concerns. Where Plato had constructed an ideal state in imagination, Cicero argued that the Roman Republic, in its best earlier form, had actually embodied the ideal mixed constitution that political philosophy recommended. The work is a defence of the traditional republic, and an implicit indictment of the direction in which the republic of his own day was moving. Only fragments survived through most of subsequent history, until a substantial portion was rediscovered in a palimpsest in the early 19th century. He was also, throughout this period, conducting an extensive correspondence that would become, after his death, one of the most valuable sources for the internal life of the late Republic. The letters to Atticus, covering decades of his life, provide a running commentary on political events, personal concerns, family matters, and philosophical reflection. Their value is precisely in their comprehensiveness. They show us a real person, not a carefully constructed literary self, conducting an actual life in a specific historical moment. The personal and family situation during these years was also developing in ways that would shape what came later. His daughter Tullia had by this point been married and divorced more than once. She had been first married to a young man from a distinguished family who had died during Cicero's exile. A second marriage had ended in divorce. In the year 50, while Cicero was away serving as governor of Cilicia, Tullia and her mother Terentia arranged for Tullia to marry Publius Cornelius Dolabella, a young and unstable aristocrat whose political ambitions did not align well with Cicero's positions. The marriage would prove difficult. His relationship with Terentia, his wife of more than 30 years, was also deteriorating during this period. Though the signs of trouble do not become fully visible in the correspondence until later, some of the strain appears to have been financial. Some of it was apparently connected to the circumstances of Tullia's marriage arrangements. Some of it was probably simply the accumulated friction of a long marriage under stress. Quintus, his younger brother, had served with Caesar in Gaul for several years. a position that had brought the family badly needed income, but that had also placed Quintus in a difficult position once the relationship between Cicero and Caesar began to deteriorate. In 51, Cicero accepted the governorship of Cilicia, a province in what is now southern Turkey. This was an office he had long avoided, but the political pressures of the moment made acceptance advisable. He served for 1 year. His administration was notable, as his earlier quaestorship in Sicily had been, for its relative honesty. He did not loot the province. He treated the provincial population with courtesy. He conducted a small but successful military campaign against hill tribes on the border, for which he received the salutation of Imperator from his troops, a designation that he valued considerably, because while Cicero was serving in Cilicia, the relationship between Caesar and Pompey, which had been the foundation of the triumvirate's arrangement, was breaking down. Crassus had died in the year 53, killed during a disastrous military campaign against the Parthians. His death had removed one of the two forces that had kept the other two in balance. Caesar's successes in Gaul had produced a reputation and a military power base that Pompey increasingly regarded as a threat to his own position. Pompey had moved, by the end of the 50s, into closer alignment with the senatorial faction that opposed Caesar. Cicero arrived back in Italy in late 50, just as the political crisis was reaching its breaking point. The correspondence with Atticus during this period is one of the most valuable documents we have for understanding how an intelligent and well-informed Roman of the senatorial class experienced the final collapse of the Republic. It is a record of intelligence inadequate to events, of principle struggling with practicality, of a man who appears to see clearly what is coming and cannot find any course of action that will prevent it. In January of the year 49, Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his legions. The civil war had begun, and Cicero, for the first time in his adult life, was about to be forced to choose a side not on the basis of what he thought was best for the Republic, but on the basis of which army was likely to kill him if he chose the wrong one. Chapter 10. Losing Tullia, a grief beyond all philosophy. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey, which began with Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in January of the year 49 before the Common Era, was not fought primarily in Italy. Caesar took control of the peninsula within about 2 months, moving with the speed that had characterized his Gallic campaigns, while Pompey and most of the senatorial establishment retreated across the Adriatic. Cicero, after months of agonized indecision, recorded in his letters to Atticus, eventually followed Pompey east in the summer of 49. His service with Pompey's forces was not distinguished. He was not a military man, and he knew it. What he found among Pompey's camp was a collection of senators in a state of mutual recrimination, inadequate to the crisis that had brought them there. His correspondence describes his dismay at what he found in the Pompeian camp, and his growing suspicion that even a Pompeian victory would produce a regime little better than what a Caesarian victory would produce. He was saved from having to see the war through to its conclusion by illness. He was sick when the Battle of Pharsalus was fought in Greece in August of 48, the engagement that destroyed Pompey's army and effectively ended the war's main phase. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered by agents of the young king Ptolemy in a calculation that the murderers hoped would win them Caesar's favour. Cicero did not go to Egypt. He returned to Italy, to the port of Brundisium, where he waited for nearly a year in uncertainty about what Caesar would do with him. Caesar, in a characteristic gesture of calculated magnanimity, pardoned Cicero and other former Pompeian supporters. Cicero was permitted to return to Rome. His property was not confiscated. His life was not threatened, but he was, in the new political order that Caesar was constructing, tolerated but marginal. It was during this period, in the year 47, that Cicero divorced Terentia after more than 30 years of marriage. The specific causes of the divorce are not fully documented. His correspondence suggests disputes over the management of family finances during his absences. Some historians have suggested that Terentia herself was interested in ending the marriage. Whatever the precise dynamics, the divorce ended what had been one of the central relationships of Cicero's adult life. A brief remarriage to his young ward, Publilia, followed. It ended quickly, and his later correspondence is retrospectively candid about the error. But the loss that would define his final years was still ahead of him. Tullia was the centre of Cicero's emotional life. From his earliest mentions of her in his correspondence, she had held a place in his affections that no other person ever matched. He called her Tulliola, little Tullia, a diminutive of endearment that he continued to use after she was grown. He wrote about her with a tenderness that is striking even in the context of Roman literature, which was not notably given to displays of paternal affection for daughters. Tullia had been married 3 times. The third marriage, to Dolabella, had been particularly difficult. Dolabella had aligned himself with Caesar during the civil war, which had placed Tullia on the opposite political side from her father during the conflict. The marriage itself had deteriorated. In the year 46, Tullia and Dolabella divorced. Tullia was pregnant at the time of the divorce. She gave birth to a son in January of 45. The pregnancy had been difficult. The delivery weakened her further. In the weeks after the birth, she moved to her father's villa at Tusculum to recover. She did not recover. In February of 45, about a month after giving birth, Tullia died. She was around 30 years old. What followed in the weeks and months after her death is one of the most extensively documented episodes of personal grief in ancient literature. It is documented because Cicero wrote about it. He wrote about it in his correspondence with Atticus, in daily letters that trace, with painful immediacy, the progression of a grief that he himself had not known was possible. He could not bear to stay at Tusculum, where she had died. He could not bear to stay in Rome, where every public space reminded him of her. He moved to a small estate belonging to Atticus in the countryside near Antium, where he could be alone. Picture him there, a small house, its shutters half closed against the spring sun. A garden he did not walk in. A library he entered only to write more letters. Pine trees outside the window. The sea distant but audible on certain afternoons when the wind came from the west. The hours long and empty. The absence that had entered every room and would not leave. He ate little. He slept badly. Atticus's letters, which do not survive, but whose content can be reconstructed from Cicero's responses, apparently urged him to rejoin society, to take up public life again, to find consolation in the traditional Roman ways. Cicero could not. He tried to explain, in letter after letter, why the ordinary consolations were not available to him. Other men had lost children and had returned to their lives. He could not. Something in him had broken that the usual repairs would not fix. He read the philosophical literature on grief. He consulted, through correspondence, with educated friends who had experienced similar losses. He had spent decades studying these questions. He had written, or was about to write, some of the most influential works on philosophical consolation in the Latin language, and he found, when the test came, that none of it was sufficient. He could not think his way out of the grief. He could not argue himself into the equanimity that Stoic and other philosophical traditions prescribed. He undertook a project to build a shrine to Tullia on a piece of property near Rome, a structure that would commemorate her memory in a permanent form. The project consumed much of his attention during the months after her death. He corresponded extensively with Atticus about the appropriate location, the design of the structure, the philosophical implications of the act itself. He wanted a place where she would be honoured not merely as a private loss, but as a presence, a continuing reality in the world. He could not settle on a site. He could not finalize the plan. The shrine was never built. The political crises that followed would eventually make the project impossible to pursue. What he did produce, in the months after Tullia's death, was a remarkable body of philosophical writing. The grief became, by his own description, part of the motive force for the work. He could not bear to be idle. He could not bear to think about what he had lost without some structured discipline to contain the thinking. So he wrote. The works of this period include the Hortensius, an exhortation to philosophy that would later be credited by Augustine of Hippo, more than 400 years later, with having set him on the path to Christianity. The Academica examined the epistemological traditions of the Greek philosophical schools. The De Finibus, on the ends of goods and evils, was a systematic treatment of the competing ethical theories of the major Greek schools. The Tusculan Disputations took up specific, practical questions about pain, death, grief, and the possibility of happiness. Cicero was, in effect, writing himself through his own bereavement, producing, as he did so, a body of work that would transmit Greek philosophical thinking into the Latin intellectual tradition. The most influential of the works written in the following year was De Officiis, On Duties, completed in the autumn of the year 44. This treatise, addressed to his son Marcus, who was then studying in Athens, examined the nature of moral obligation, the relationship between what is honourable and what is expedient, and the conduct appropriate to a person committed to public service. De Officiis would become, in the centuries that followed, one of the most widely read works of classical ethics. It was one of the first books printed after the invention of the printing press in Europe. It was studied by medieval theologians, by Renaissance humanists, and by the generation of North American political thinkers who shaped the founding of the United States. The deeper lesson of this period of his life, for those who would read his work and learn from it afterward, was something harder than the specific doctrines he articulated. It was the lesson that philosophy, no matter how extensively studied, does not fully remove the pain that life delivers to those who live it seriously. The Stoic ideal of equanimity in the face of loss is real and genuinely valuable as an aspiration. But aspiration and arrival, as his grief for Tullia seems to have taught him, are not the same thing. His grief did not diminish in proportion to the philosophical work he produced. The work did not cure him. What the work did was give him a structure within which to carry what he could not put down. a discipline within which to continue functioning, a productive direction in which to channel energies that would otherwise have consumed themselves in helpless sorrow. This, more than any specific argument he made in any specific treatise, may be the practical wisdom that he left to the centuries that followed. The mind is not strong enough to overcome everything life brings to it, but the mind, disciplined by the long habit of thinking, can build containers large enough to hold what cannot be dissolved. And then, at the moment, he was least prepared for one more great test. Rome came back for him. Chapter 11. Caesar dies, and Cicero sees his final chance. On the 15th of March in the year 44 before the Common Era, in a meeting hall attached to the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was convening that day, Gaius Julius Caesar was stabbed to death by a group of Roman senators acting in coordinated assassination. The leaders of the conspiracy were Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, both former Pompeian supporters, whom Caesar had pardoned and restored to political prominence. Cicero was not part of the conspiracy. He had not been informed of the plans. This exclusion appears to have reflected the conspirators' assessment of his unreliability for secret operations, an assessment that was probably correct. Cicero was a man whose first instinct in any crisis was to write a letter about it, often to more than one correspondent. But when the assassination was carried out, his response was immediate and unambiguous. He supported it. In his correspondence and in his public statements over the days and weeks that followed, he described the killing as a tyrannicide, the legitimate removal of a ruler who had become a tyrant. He believed, at least in the first moments after the assassination, that the killing would restore the Republic. This assessment proved, over the following weeks, to be badly wrong. The conspirators had killed Caesar without having a plan for what came next. They had assumed, or hoped, that the removal of the single individual who had accumulated extraordinary powers would automatically produce the restoration of the previous institutional order. Into the vacuum stepped Marcus Antonius, known to history as Mark Antony. Antony had been Caesar's co-consul for the year 44. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, he moved rapidly to consolidate his own position. He gave a funeral oration for Caesar in the Forum that mobilized the urban population against the conspirators. He gained control of Caesar's papers and funds. The conspirators, their position deteriorating, eventually left Rome for provincial assignments. Brutus and Cassius went east, where they began to organize military forces for what they now saw as an unavoidable confrontation with Antony. The restoration of the Republic had not happened. What had happened was that one form of Caesarian authority had been replaced by another. Cicero, watching this unfold over the spring and summer of 44, made the most consequential decision of his late career. He decided to oppose Antony directly and publicly, using the only weapon he had ever really possessed. The campaign against Antony took the form of a series of speeches and writings that Cicero produced over the following months. The speeches are known by the name Cicero himself gave them in a letter to Marcus Brutus as the Philippics, in conscious imitation of the speeches that the Athenian orator Demosthenes had delivered against Philip of Macedon more than 3 centuries earlier. There were 14 of them in all, delivered over a span of about 10 months, from September of 44 through April of 43. They constitute the final major rhetorical production of his career. They represent his most sustained and most dangerous exercise of public speech. The Philippics went after a specific individual with the full force of Cicero's rhetorical arsenal. They described Antony as a man of dissolute character, a threat to the constitutional order, a would-be tyrant. They described him in language designed not merely to criticize him, but to destroy him politically by making it impossible for decent people to support him. The political logic of the Philippics was that Antony had to be opposed now, by any available means, because if he were not opposed now, he would eventually consolidate the kind of authority that would make opposition impossible. Cicero recognized that fighting Antony required allies, and the allies available included some who were problematic from a constitutional standpoint. The most significant of these was a young man named Gaius Octavius, who in later tradition would be called Octavian during this period of his career, and later Augustus, was Caesar's adopted son and heir. He was 19 years old when Caesar was killed, and he had arrived in Italy shortly afterward to claim his inheritance and his position as the son of the murdered dictator. Cicero initially regarded Octavian with some condescension, seeing him as a useful young man whose connection to Caesar's memory and control over Caesar's funds could be deployed against Antony. His letters from this period contain passages in which he refers to Octavian in terms that imply Cicero believed the young man could be guided, used, and eventually set aside once his usefulness had ended. This assessment of Octavian appears, in hindsight, to have been one of the most serious misjudgments of Cicero's political career. Octavian was not a young man who could be guided. He was, even at 19, an extraordinarily calculating political operator whose instincts for the accumulation and retention of power would eventually prove to be among the most effective in the history of the ancient world. The Philippics worked, for a time. Antony, by early 43, was forced to flee Rome and take refuge in Cisalpine Gaul, where he laid siege to one of the conspirators in that province. The Senate, under Cicero's influence, declared Antony a public enemy and dispatched military forces against him. Antony was defeated at the battles of Forum Gallorum and Mutina in April of 43. The senatorial cause appeared to be winning, but the two consuls of the year both died in the course of these operations. This left Octavian in command of the forces that had been nominally cooperating with the senatorial armies. Octavian, at 19, now demanded to be appointed consul himself. The Senate refused, but also failed to organize any effective opposition to his demand. Octavian marched on Rome with his legions. The Senate capitulated. He was elected consul in August of 43, and once in office, he moved to reconcile with Antony. The meeting that ended Cicero's hopes took place on a small island in a river near the city of Bononia in northern Italy. In November of the year 43, Octavian, Antony, and a third man named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus met for several days of negotiation. They emerged with an arrangement known to later history as the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the earlier informal triumvirate, this one was formalized by legislation. The three men were granted, for a period of 5 years, sweeping legal authority to reorganize the Roman state. Their first major act was to produce a proscription list. The proscription technique, which had not been used since Sulla's dictatorship nearly 40 years earlier, returned. A list of names was posted in Rome. The men named were declared outlaws. Their property was forfeit. Anyone who killed them would receive a reward. Cicero's name was on the list. The negotiations among the triumvirs that had produced the list were conducted, according to later sources, including Plutarch and Appian, with the cold transactional logic of men dividing up hostages. Each of the three had to agree to the proscription of men whom the others considered enemies. Octavian was said to have resisted the inclusion of Cicero for some time. Antony, whose hatred of the man who had spent the past year attacking him publicly was personal and implacable, insisted. Octavian, according to these accounts, eventually agreed. The agreement was made. The lists were posted, and in a small villa south of Rome, an old man who had spent the last year writing some of the most important speeches of his life received word that he had been condemned to death by the young man he had thought he could use. Chapter 12. The Price of Speaking the Truth. The news of the proscription reached Cicero in the first days of December in the year 43 before the Common Era. He was at his villa in Tusculum, the country property about 15 miles southeast of Rome, where he had spent so much of his adult life writing, inking, and recovering from the various exhaustions of his public career. His brother Quintus was with him, along with Quintus's son and a small household staff. When the messenger arrived with the names on the list, the two older men had only hours to decide what to do. The obvious course was flight. Brutus and Cassius were in the east, organizing armies for what would eventually become the final confrontation of the civil wars. If Cicero could reach the coast, board a ship, and cross the Adriatic, he could join them. The practical problems were considerable. He was 63 years old. His health had never been robust. The journey to the coast would be difficult. The weather was turning toward winter. Any port from which he sailed would be watched by agents of the triumvirs, and Cicero himself, by his own later admissions and by the consistent testimony of the sources, does not appear to have been psychologically prepared for the journey he was contemplating. The previous exile, 17 years earlier, had nearly destroyed him. The prospect of another produced in him a paralysis that the sources describe with considerable detail. What followed, over the first 2 weeks of December, was a series of false starts and reversals. He left Tusculum for the coast, intending to sail. He turned back. He started again. He reached the coast at Astura, a small port on the western coast of Italy. He boarded a ship. The ship sailed a short distance. He ordered it back to land. Picture the scene. A grey December sea, choppy with the winter wind. A small merchant vessel rocking at anchor in a shallow cove. An old man standing on the deck, looking back at the coast of Italy, unable to commit to leaving it. The wind cold on his face. The sailors watching, uncertain, as he keeps changing his mind. Finally, the order to return to shore, the small boat rowing him back through the grey water to the beach, the wet sand, the winter sky, the impossibility of deciding. And then, a day or two later, the same scene in reverse, the same hesitation, the same failure to act. The ancient accounts, preserved most extensively in Plutarch and in Appian, describe a man whose will was not equal to what his situation demanded. Quintus and his son had separated from Cicero at some point during these days, apparently attempting to return to their own property to secure supplies and funds for the journey. This decision proved fatal for both of them. They were betrayed by a servant, hunted down by soldiers, and killed. Cicero did not learn of their deaths before his own. His final movements took him from the coast at Astura back inland toward his villa at Formiae, which sat on the coast somewhat further south. The reasons for this reverse movement are not fully clear in the sources. Some accounts suggest that he had decided to make a stand at his own villa and die in a place associated with his own life rather than in flight. Some suggest simply that his will was broken. The soldiers found him on the morning of the 7th of December. They were led by a centurion named Herennius and a military tribune named Popilius Laenas. In the account, Plutarch would preserve, Popilius was a man whom Cicero had defended in a criminal case years earlier, saving him from conviction. The irony of that detail is so exact that some modern historians have questioned whether it is historical fact or literary embellishment added by later writers. We will let the detail stand as Plutarch recorded it, noting that it may have been shaped by the tradition as much as by the event. Cicero was being carried in a litter, the enclosed carriage used by wealthy Romans for travel and by invalids, his household slaves. A small group of whom had remained loyal were prepared to resist the soldiers. He ordered them not to fight. He told them to put the litter down. He extended his neck from the litter to receive the sword. In the account Plutarch preserved, Cicero looked directly at the soldiers without fear. He did not beg. He did not resist. His hair was unkempt from the previous days of flight. His face was thin, grey, lined with the exhaustion of a man who had spent his whole adult life speaking and had now run out of things to say. He waited. Herennius struck. The first blow was reportedly not fatal, and it took more than one stroke to complete the beheading. When the head was severed, the soldiers also cut off the hands, acting on what the sources describe as the explicit orders of Antony, who had specified that the hands associated with the Philippics were to be taken along with the head that had spoken them. The severed head and hands were carried back to Rome. They were brought to Antony. In the account preserved in Cassius Dio, the account we began this story with, Antony's wife Fulvia took the head in her hands. She drew the pins from her hair. She drove them through the dead tongue. Once, and again, and again. Antony had the head and hands nailed to the rostra, the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum, from which Cicero had delivered so many of the speeches that had defined his career. The display was deliberate. Any Roman who walked through the Forum in the weeks that followed would see, directly above the platform where the voice of the Republic had risen for decades, the dismembered remains of the man who had been that voice. The crowd that gathered to see the head, according to the ancient accounts, wept. Cicero had been, for many Romans, the last remaining symbol of the Republic they had known. His death, displayed in this way, forced a recognition that the Republic was not merely damaged, but was finished. Whatever was going to come after was going to be something different. And what was going to come after had now demonstrated what it was willing to do to the men who had represented what came before. The proscription took hundreds of other lives across Italy in the weeks and months that followed. Senators, equestrians, men of various ranks who had been marked for reasons ranging from political opposition to personal grudges. But the death of Cicero was the killing that the tradition remembered most clearly, the one that the historians who wrote afterward returned to as the defining moment of the transition from republic to empire. His slaves, the small, loyal group who had been with him at the end, arranged such burial as was possible under the circumstances. The body, minus the head and hands that had been taken to Rome, was buried with what rites could be performed. The specific location of the grave is not reliably documented, but the death was only part of what happened in December of the year 43. What happened alongside the death, and what would prove to matter far more over the long run of subsequent history, was the survival of something the triumvirs had not thought to destroy. The writings survived, the letters, the speeches, the philosophical treatises, the rhetorical textbooks, the vast body of work that Cicero had produced across 50 years of writing was not destroyed. It was not, for the most part, systematically suppressed. Within a generation of his death, copies of his works were circulating throughout the educated Roman world, being read in schools, being used as models for students learning to write and speak, being preserved in libraries, being transmitted forward in the continuous manuscript tradition that would eventually carry them through the fall of the Western Empire, through the medieval centuries, through the rediscoveries of the Renaissance, and down to the modern world. The voice that had been silenced on the rostra had been silenced only in the immediate physical sense. The sounds had stopped, but the sounds had been captured in writing, and the writing had escaped the triumvir's attention. This was not a consolation available to the dying man on the morning of the 7th of December. He did not know what would happen to his writings, whether he died believing that his life's work had failed, or whether some part of him trusted that the words would outlast the sword. We cannot know. The sources do not tell us what he was thinking in that final moment. But the measure of a life is not always taken at the moment of death, and the measure of the life that ended on that road in Formiae would be taken and retaken by every generation of readers for the next 2,000 years. Chapter 13. The Death on the Litter, and the Immortality that began. The Rome that Cicero had tried to save did not continue. The constitutional order he had defended, the balance between Senate and people and magistrates that he had described in De Re Publica, did not survive the struggles of the years that followed his death. Brutus and Cassius were defeated at the battles of Philippi in the year 42, and both took their own lives in the aftermath. The triumvirs consolidated their hold on the Roman world, and then, as was predictable, turned against each other. Lepidus was marginalized. Antony aligned himself with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra, and eventually, with her, opposed Octavian in the final war that culminated in the Battle of Actium in the year 31. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated. Both killed themselves the following year in Alexandria. Octavian was left as the sole master of the Roman world. Over the decades that followed, he constructed the political arrangement that historians now call the Principate, an imperial system that preserved the outward forms of the Republic while vesting effective power in a single individual. He received the name Augustus from the Senate in the year 27 and ruled under that name until his death in 14 of the Common Era. But within this new system, and somewhat unexpectedly, the writings of Cicero were not suppressed. They were preserved, copied, studied, and taught. The man who had been killed by the forces that created the imperial system became, in the imperial system that followed, one of the most widely read authors in the Latin language. Every educated Roman of the following centuries read Cicero. His vocabulary, his sentence rhythms, his habits of argumentation became embedded in the Latin language itself. The tradition continued after the Western Empire ended. In the centuries following the collapse of Roman political authority in the West, the writings of Cicero were preserved by the monastic copyists of the medieval Christian world. Augustine of Hippo, the church father whose writings shaped Christian theology for more than 1,000 years, had been set on the path to his intellectual conversion by reading Cicero's Hortensius as a young man. The influence of De Officiis on medieval moral theology was profound. The rediscovery of additional Ciceronian works in the 14th and 15th centuries by humanist scholars including Petrarch, who found a collection of Cicero's letters in a library in Verona in the year 1345, helped to trigger the cultural movement we now call the Renaissance. The letters to Atticus, in particular, gave educated Europeans their first direct access to the interior life of an ancient Roman. The writings reached the founders of the United States as well. Among the American Revolutionary generation, Cicero was one of the major classical influences on political thought. John Adams, who would become the second president of the United States, studied Cicero throughout his adult life. Thomas Jefferson owned multiple editions of Cicero's works. The political vocabulary of the American founding, the appeals to natural law, to the mixed constitution, to the rights of the citizen, to the danger of concentrated power, drew in part on Ciceronian sources through various intermediate channels. The Cicero who was read by the American founders was, in some respects, a simplified version of the full, complicated man who had died on the road near Formier. He was a figure of principle and eloquence whose political failures and personal vulnerabilities were muted in favour of his contributions to political theory. This is true of the way most historical figures are received by later generations. The simplification is not dishonest, necessarily. It is how posterity makes use of the past, taking what can be used and setting aside what cannot, but the full Cicero is available too. For anyone who wants to encounter him, his letters, in particular, survive in quantity and in a state of preservation that allows a reader 2,000 years later to watch a specific human being move through a specific life. No comparable record exists for any other figure from the ancient world. What does that real person, seen through the full record that survives, turn out to be? He was a man of genuine intellectual gifts, trained to their highest possible development, applied across a career that used them in the service of causes he believed in. He was a man of considerable personal vanity, who never entirely recovered from his discovery that his suppression of the Catiline conspiracy had not produced the lifetime of universal admiration that he had expected it to produce. He was a man whose physical courage was limited and who acknowledged this, sometimes openly. He was a man of deep affections, who loved his daughter with an intensity that his philosophy could neither moderate nor heal. He was, in the political dimension, a man who appears to have understood the constitutional arrangement of the Roman Republic as deeply as almost any contemporary observer, and who was helpless, in the end, to prevent its destruction. He saw what was coming. He described what was coming, in speeches and writings that survive, with a clarity that few other contemporary observers matched. And he could not stop it. The forces that were destroying the Republic were larger than any individual voice could contain, and he discovered, over the course of his career, that his voice was not exempt from this limitation. The question that his life leaves open is not resolved by the death on the road near Formier, or by the afterlife of the writings that survived him. It is the question that was implicit in his life from the moment he took the Roscius case as a young man, the question of whether words can actually matter against the forces of power that operate without reference to them. Cicero gave one version of an answer. He devoted his life to the proposition that they could. He achieved, through that devotion, a political career that would have been impossible for a man of his background under any other assumption. He also demonstrated, through his failures and through his final destruction, that words had limits. The voice that many Romans believed had saved the Republic from Catiline could not save it from Caesar, or from Antony, or from the young Octavian who would survive to reshape the Roman world. But the writings outlasted the sword. We began on the rostra, on a cold December morning in the year 43 before the Common Era, with the image of a head and 2 hands nailed to the wood above the place where Cicero had spoken. We have followed the life that led to that morning. The boy from Arpinum, with a name that meant chickpea. The young advocate who took the case no one else would take. The new man who climbed the ladder of Roman office without the family connections that the ladder was built for. The consul who faced down a conspiracy and believed he had saved his country. The exile who discovered that his philosophical education had not prepared him for what the loss of his public role would actually feel like. The father who could not write his way out of his grief for his daughter. The old man who stepped back into public life, with his voice as his only weapon, against a threat he understood could not be answered any other way. The man on the litter who did not resist. Picture, for a moment, a library somewhere in the present day. It might be a university library with high ceilings and long wooden tables. Students bent over their work in the late afternoon light. It might be a quiet room in a private house, with a single lamp burning late and a window open to the sound of traffic on a distant street. It might be the place where you are sitting right now, somewhere, tonight. While you are listening to this, a person is opening a volume of Cicero. They are reading a letter he wrote to Atticus from the small estate near Antium in the weeks after his daughter died. They are reading a passage from De Officiis about what a person owes to other people and to the community. They are reading a speech he delivered in the Roman Forum 2,000 years ago. The voice is still speaking, in a different language, on the other side of the world from where it was spoken. 20 centuries after the morning, the hands that wrote were nailed to the wood. The voice is still speaking. The question his life poses to anyone who reads it afterward is not really a question about Rome. Rome is gone. The specific political arrangements he tried to defend have been replaced by arrangements he could not have imagined. The question is about what a person who loves a particular kind of order, who sees that order being eroded by forces larger than any individual response, should actually do with a life. He decided that the answer was to speak carefully, with as much preparation and craft as could be managed, to speak in writing as well as in speeches, so that the speaking could outlast the moment, to keep speaking even when the speaking became dangerous. He paid for this decision. The payment was extensive, and it was final, but the speaking itself, the voice that he built across decades of deliberate work and that he used until the moment the soldiers reached the litter, survived in forms that he could not have foreseen. It is still being heard. It is being heard now. If the story of a man who chose to speak, who knew what it would cost, and who kept speaking anyway, has given you something to carry with you tonight, I am glad to have told it. Thank you for staying until the end. Until the next story. I wish you a quiet night, and when the morning comes, may you find your own voice worth using.